Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. In February of 1968, the LDS Church magazine, The Improvement Era, had a startling story to report. They said that after so many years of being missing, the papyri that Joseph Smith had used to translate the Book of Abraham, which made up the part of the Pearl of Great Price, had been rediscovered. And it started a series of articles by Hugh Nibley, who basically for about a year was explaining the significance of this. There was a great anticipation that here was hard evidence that was going to prove that Joseph Smith could translate ancient documents. The plates that he had claimed to receive in Reformed Egyptian, he claimed had been taken back by the angel, but here were hard copies of something that he had supposedly translated by the power of the Spirit into Scripture. And there was a great excitement that this was going to prove that he was everything he claimed to be. But over time, the enthusiasm seemed to wane, and the translation that was expected by so many to be affirmed never seemed to be forthcoming. And it began to cause doubts in the minds of members of the LDS Church. And we have with us this evening Mr. Charles Larson, the author of By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus. It is a study of the papyri and of the Book of Abraham, and it's our great privilege to have him with us this evening. Mr. Larson, great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I've touched on the Book of Abraham, but can you give us an idea, what is the Book of Abraham?
The Book of Abraham is a portion of the Pearl of Great Price, which is, of course, the fourth part of the LDS Standard Works. The Pearl of Great Price is a portion which purports to have been basically Abraham's diary that he kept, and that he wrote his account that was later read, or excerpts of it read by Moses and used to go ahead and create Scripture. So this is the first-hand writing of the first of the great patriarchs, miraculously preserved, that fell into the hands of Joseph Smith so that he could produce these writings and introduce doctrines into the LDS Church back in the 1830s and 1840s.
Now, one of the stumbling blocks for a lot of people in the 1830s was that we had many manuscripts, had thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. We had many manuscripts of the Old Testament, but none of them were the original autographs, the ones that were actually written by the people originally and maintained. Joseph Smith claimed that this was not just a copy of something written by Abraham, that had been passed down through various copies, but the very title of your book was his claim that it was written by Abraham himself by his own hand upon papyrus.
Exactly. As you mentioned, with the Bible, no matter how ancient the text that we use, whether we're looking at the Chester Beatty Papyri or the Sinaiticus or the Vaticanus, we always have something that is a few hundred years removed. And we look to these as texts in Greek and earlier texts in Hebrew to try to go ahead and determine the authenticity of modern translations. What Joseph Smith was claiming with the Book of Abraham, he was claiming that this was the writing by Abraham's own hand upon the papyrus that had been preserved, wrapped up with a mummy and buried for time until, of course, the Lord would go and bring it forth to someone who was able to translate it. What a lot of people today probably don't realize is that in the 1830s, Joseph Smith could have said that it could have been written in Martian, and he could have done a translation of it, and no one could have challenged him on it. Now, we know that, of course, Champollion began working on the Rosetta Stone shortly after it was discovered, and that he eventually began to decipher the Egyptian language by 1820. This was the type of thing that was only in rarefied university circles at the time, though. To the general public, Egyptian things were totally mysterious. The only thing you knew about the Egyptian was what you read in the Bible, with the account of Pharaoh and Joseph and so forth. So anything that Joseph Smith produced would have startling significance to the people, and no one could really challenge him on it, at least no one that his followers would believe.
Well, let's back up a little bit. How does Joseph Smith, who is in Kirtland, Ohio, end up with Egyptian papyri in the first place?
Well, he bought them from a traveling salesman.
Okay. This doesn't seem like normal wares for a
in
traveling salesman.
No, but you could probably find a lot of things back in those days. These were basically the story behind the mummies and so forth that were discovered in Egypt, along with thousands and thousands of other mummies in the early 19th century, and how four of them managed to go and find their way into Midwestern America in upstate Ohio. You know, that's a long and convoluted story, and other people have done the history of that and kind of worked it out with people like Michael Chandler and so forth. This fellow Michael Chandler was a traveling showman, and he had acquired, I'll put it that way, he had acquired this collection of Egyptian artifacts, 4 mummies and a number of scrolls and rolls and so forth. And he, you know, in the days when you didn't have television, you didn't have movie theaters, there were a lot of lecturers that would go around and exhibit natural wonders. Okay, if you had a 2-headed calf or something, it would be the type of thing that you would, you know, take around. But this was wonderful stuff, and it was a great moneymaker too. When he showed up in Kirtland, Joseph Smith, you know, of course, attended this, and I, you know, it's a little unclear whether Michael Chandler had sought out Joseph Smith or whether Joseph Smith's people had sought out Michael Chandler, but the gist of it was, the final upshot of it was, that Joseph declared that some of these writings contained the very manuscript that Abraham kept while he was in Egypt, and that another scroll was the writings of Joseph. And you know, they contain wonderful secrets and things. So some influential people pooled their resources, whether at their own behest or at Joseph's urging, and somehow Michael Chandler was persuaded to go and part with these treasures. But of course, not just the scrolls that Joseph Smith was interested in. They had to buy the whole show. They had to buy the wagon, they had to buy the mummies, they had to buy everything, which was fine. So that just meant more stories could be told about them and more people would be curious about them. And then Joseph could begin unlocking the secrets on these scrolls and discovering all kinds of things on there that he could go ahead and, astronomical things about a weird place called Kolob, things about priesthood order, you know, many things that he'd been teaching into the church. So these scrolls were very important to Joseph at a time when he needed something substantial to be able to go and hold people together.
Okay, they were having some problems there in Kirtland, weren't they?
Well, they were. The Kirtland Safety Society bank that Joseph started in 1837 didn't do well in the Panic of 37. He tried to go ahead and persuade people that it wasn't like the banks because this was the opposite of a bank. This was an anti-bank. And so well, that's another story. But one of the biggest problems that he had was the failure of Zion's Camp. Okay, now Zion's Camp was a military movement that he led to go down and reinstate the saints that had been driven from their homes in Jackson County, Missouri. So they put together this big fanfare in Ohio where they'd go and march on down there, the Army of Zion, and they would go ahead and reclaim Jackson County, Missouri, and reinstall the saints. Didn't quite happen that way. The thing fell apart, everybody got cholera, and they pretty much went home. But Joseph was able to later use that experience to go and determine who he was going to pick for leaders, and Brigham Young, of course, just shined on the whole thing. But a lot of people were upset because Joseph had pretty much promised that this was what was going to happen, and when it didn't, he came out with the old line, well, because of people's unfaithfulness, it didn't happen. So, you know, they were getting a little tired of that. He needed something to energize the fact that he was a prophet and a seer and a revelator, and a seer is supposed to be able to interpret things, and so this gave him the vehicle that he needed.
So they purchased the traveling exhibit for $2,400,
I believe it was that.
which doesn't seem like a great deal of money until you realize that not many years earlier, they had the United States had bought the Louisiana Territory for what, $3 million? So, so it's roughly 1/1000th of that, you know, or thereabouts.
It was a great sum of money in those days. So you could buy a pretty nice house for that much money.
So they bought this exhibit. He begins translating in 1835. Does he actually issue the Book of Abraham at that time, or is it later?
Oh, no. little bits and pieces of it get out. He's using this for a long time. He has a school, a cadre of followers that are just fascinated by it. Some of them his scribes, some of them people that he's cultivating for leadership positions or for other positions that he has in mind. He starts basically a school where he will go and produce a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language and have everybody go and copy symbols from the things, and then he would tell them what the translations are and how there are many degrees of translation that could be ascribed to this. One little symbol could mean one thing, and then it could mean something else if it has a dot by it, and it can mean paragraphs and paragraphs if it has a dot and a little squiggle, so on and so forth. So people were eating this up all through the 30s, and in the meantime he was producing a manuscript. That didn't begin to be published, though, until they moved to Nauvoo. And then it began to be published as installments in, I believe it was the Millennial Star.
Or Times and Seasons.
Times and Seasons, right. Millennial Star was in Great Britain.
Right.
Okay.
I personally...
I'm old, but I'm not that old. I can't quite remember. Okay.
Well, of the early Mormons, I kind of like the Pratts the best. I mean, partly is someone I can deal with because he draws a line in the sand, and then Orson, of course, is famous for his opposition to the Adam God doctrine, and so I'm not a Mormon scholar, but what little bit of reading I've done among the peripheral characters, the Pratts are some of my favorites.
The Pratts are interesting boys, yes.
Also understand why Parley got killed in Arkansas, but that's another story. All right, so when Joseph Smith claims to translate this, no one in America could read hieroglyphics, as you alluded to earlier.
Exactly. Well, the lay people couldn't. There were a few people at universities, and they didn't really know what they were doing. They were just starting to go and break it.
Okay, so
it was still many years away before any scholar anywhere in the world could comfortably look at an Egyptian text and come up with a meaningful rendition of what it actually said.
So the actual Book of Abraham ended up being issued in roughly 1842. Smith then is killed in 1844.
Right.
And the papyri end up being separated from the church, from the Utah branch of the followers of Smith, don't they?
Right. When Joseph Smith was killed, there were a lot of theories about how the succession was going to go. Now, everyone in Utah here naturally assumes, well, Brigham Young arrived and the mantle of prophet fell upon him, and everybody said amen, and they all followed him to Utah. But that's not quite how it was working out when Joseph Smith was killed. Sidney Rigdon was an extremely powerful and frustrated figure in the church, and he had been the number 2 man for a very long time. And he assumed naturally that he was going to go and lead people. The Rigdonites had quite a following. Rigdon was actually the scripture and doctrinal authority within the church, second only to Joseph Smith. And many believe that he actually provided many of the interpretations to Smith that Smith would go and then claim as his own ideas. So Rigdon was very powerful. Then you had Hiram Page, you had Joseph Strang, you had so many different people trying to lead. It basically broke down to 2 groups. The people that didn't follow Brigham Young and the people that did follow Brigham Young. And all through the year 1845 and going into 46, that terrible winter with crossing the ice and so forth, these camps separated themselves, even right there in Nauvoo. Emma Smith became symbolic of the ones that would not follow Brigham Young, and she remained behind. She was Joseph's primary heir for his physical estate, and that included all of his physical possessions that Brigham Young's followers and secretaries and so forth weren't able to go and spirit out of the mansion house. And so it also included the papyri. The Utah Mormons with Brigham Young were able to take only one small scrap of papyrus with them, and that remained buried in the church historians' vaults for decades and decades. In fact, I think that the first time that it was even alluded to publicly in print was in 1937 in an article by Sidney Sperry. But it was then considered to be the only part of the Book of Abraham that survived, because as the story went, and as the story was believed for tens and tens of years, Emma Smith, who later married a man named Bideman, Emma Smith Bideman, sold these papyri to where they ended up later on in the museum in Chicago. And then during the Great Chicago Fire in the 1870s, it burned to the ground. The papyri were destroyed. So there was no way to go and prove whether Joseph Smith was telling the truth or not. Just like with the Book of Mormon on the gold plates, we can't go and check that translation or even see what the things look like because he gave it back to the angel. So again, off the hook, and we have to rely on faith and our trust in Joseph Smith because after all, he said he was a prophet, so he wouldn't lie to us. So there it was.
But things changed a lot in 1966.
Things changed a lot when these papyri were discovered in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They turned out to be the bulk of the papyri that Joseph Smith at one time had owned. Now, Hugh Nibley later on tried to claim, oh, this is just such a small part, and obviously there are missing portions which must have been the real writings of Abraham, but that's just one of the excuses that they used. I mean, we have, from the descriptions and contemporary accounts of the time, this is what it was. There are only a few missing pieces. We have the gist and the context of his entire collection.
And this was discovered by a professor from the University of Utah who was doing some work there.
Yes, a Middle Eastern scholarship type of professor, Atala or something like that.
Yeah, I forget his name.
I forget his name too.
But not only did he recognize them because of the similarity to the facsimiles in the
now he was non-LDS, you know.
Right, but he did recognize the facsimiles from the Book of Abraham.
Right.
And in addition to that similarity, they were also pasted to stabilize.
These papyri were stabilized by pasting them with flour paste or animal paste on paper. And on the backs of the paper, and even on the fronts of some of them, showing through the holes and all, were sketches and drawings and notes, elevations showing the Kirtland Temple, things like this, okay, and handwritten notes by Joseph Smith's scribes and so forth. So the similarity to one of the pictures to this facsimile one which you mentioned, plus those, told this fellow right away that these must be the papyri that the Mormons have been missing for all of these years that I've heard them talk about. Won't they be excited when I go and tell them that they're still in existence? And so he happily went back to Utah and told people about that, and that began the negotiations where eventually the Metropolitan Museum donated the entire collection back to the LDS Church. Not to Emma Biderman.
Yeah. So the Utah Church ends up with 10 pieces of the papyri.
Right.
They've cracked and broken over the years, but they've been stabilized. They had one piece, as you mentioned, we'll come back to, that they had managed to bring to Utah with them back in the 1840s. The difference between Joseph Smith's day and the 1960s is that there was a pretty well-established, well-recognized way of translating these hieroglyphics now, weren't there?
Yes, 100 years makes a lot of difference, 120 maybe even more. Even by the 1860s, when Joseph Smith was, long dead, by the 1860s it was possible to go and look at the facsimiles as they were reproduced in the newly published Pearl of Great Price, and Egyptologists said this is false. They began criticizing them even that early, which is why the church had been so defensive about them and why they had insisted that, that may look like this to you, but if only we had the rest of the scrolls, you could see that Joseph Smith was telling the truth. Okay. Well, by the 1960s, again, Egyptology is about as readable as Hebrew. Okay.
Now, one thing I sort of skipped over, in the intervening period, there had been work on our examination of the facsimiles you alluded to just a moment ago.
Yes.
Back at the turn of the century, back in the early 1900s, the Episcopal Bishop of Utah had called on scholars to review these things, and they said that these images were actually fairly standard images.
Very standard, yes.
And that there were differences where in one of the facsimiles it shows the wicked priest about to try to kill Abraham.
Facsimile one.
You have, they said that that's supposed to be Anubis, and it's supposed to have a jackal's head, and that there were other differences that were striking. This is a very common motif.
Right.
And when this papyri surfaces, if we could pull that graphic back up, you could actually see that all the points that they said were wrong, that part of the papyrus is missing.
Right. The head of Anubis is missing on the papyri. The hand of Anubis is missing on the papyri, yet there's a pencil sketch on the paper behind it showing the figure on the couch throwing his hands up as the knife is about to be plunged into him, although the knife is held at a little different angle than it is eventually in facsimile 1. All of the key elements that the professional Egyptologists way back at the turn of the century, 1900 or so, 1912 I believe it was, pointed out were wrong, were not there. They were parts of the scroll that had come apart as it was being unrolled by people to go and explore it clear back in the 1800s, in the 1830s. And we know that those parts were missing because all of the sections that adjoin it are missing the same wave pattern that had been broken off or stuck together or too degraded. So you have this, instead of a nice clean scroll being unrolled, you have one with broken parts, and the parts that were rolled upon each other that are missing as you unroll it. Okay, so we know that those parts were missing in Joseph Smith's day, and what interpretations he was giving to them were what was in his imagination. No one could prove him wrong until they began challenging him on it around 1912, and then at that time Mormon scholar says, well, yeah, you can say that it should have a jackal's head, but it doesn't, does it? You should be doing this and that and the other thing, but he's doing this, isn't he? So Joseph Smith said it was this way, this is the way it had to be. Well, now we know why Joseph Smith said it was that way. It's because those parts were missing.
Now, when the LDS Church first got these papyri, they were actually excited, weren't they? I mean, as shown by the...
There was every... how am I going to be diplomatic about this? There was every indication, every visible manifestation of excitement about it. I think that, quite frankly, behind the scenes there was quite a bit of apprehension because these are intelligent people, and, well, they're also people of faith and also people of trust, I believe, for the most part. They weren't stupid and they weren't unschooled. They were aware of the severe impact of some of the challenges that had been raised, and you have to be a little apprehensive about what's going to come forth from it. You know, they weren't these blind-eyed fanatics who just assumed that everything had to be right. They had their fingers crossed.
And this February 1968 Improvement Era, it started a whole series of articles, goes on for roughly a year, where
every month.
Hugh Nibley keeps writing these articles that never seem to, they never translate the past or the papyri, and I've heard that it was actually admitted that he was trying to buy time until he could learn to read.
Yes, he admitted this much later on. You see, Hugh Nibley is celebrated as the preemptive scholar of Mormonism and so forth, and he was an intelligent man. He certainly knew a number of classical and ancient languages so that he could work his way through, and he knew how to approach a study of it. He knew that to study these scrolls, he would not go to the old manuscript of Joseph Smith's alphabet and grammar and try to figure out how to read Egyptian. He would go to some of the best scholars that were available at Brown University and others to speak with real Egyptologists and find out what these things meant. In the meantime, his job was to produce something faith-promoting, to be able to publish in the church's magazine that would go out and be read by the church members. And so every month he would write something faith-promoting. Whether it made any sense to him or to anyone else or not. I've heard one person say that one of the charming aspects of Hugh Nibley is that you have no idea what he's talking about. And I think that he was equally charmed by that fact.
Now, to me as an outsider, this is very revealing because the prophet of the LDS Church claims to be the prophet, seer, and revelator, bearing the same mantle as Joseph Smith. And as part of that, he is supposed to be able to translate ancient text. But the prophet didn't try to do that, did he?
Well, you've never been LDS, have you?
No.
Okay. That is something that a person who has never been LDS or who is not LDS will pick up on, because we're aware of the claims that Joseph Smith made about those offices and what they meant. And from time to time, Mormons themselves have used those claims in order to bolster the fact that they're special. But I don't know of any member of the church who expected the David O. McKay at the time, was it?
Probably.
Yeah, I believe it was David O. McKay at the time, and then, that expected this old man to actually sit down and all of a sudden begin speaking in tongues ancient. Okay. In fact, most Latter-day Saints that I know of, sincere, believing, committed Latter-day Saints, would think that the idea was ridiculous, that the leader of the church would take upon himself the role of a seer, even though he was called to be a seer, unless God had specifically given him that task. That's their out, you see.
Okay. So they try to buy time, and then it becomes apparent to them that the papyri are not from 4,000 years ago, but not even quite from 2,000 years earlier. Instead of being from 2,000 years before Christ, where it could have actually been Abraham's own writing, that it was from roughly the first century.
They essentially amounted to a series of Ptolemaic or early Roman funerary texts. And they were written in hieratic Egyptian, which is essentially for want of a better way of describing it, a cursive form of hieroglyphic. It was not even Demotic writing. It was not even the later versions lending toward Greek. But it would date from roughly about 200 years before Christ to maybe 100 years after Christ for the majority of the writings.
So nothing close to the 4,000 years.
Nothing close to anything being contemporaneous with Abraham that could have been written by his hand.
Now, there are some people who may say, well, what's to prove that these are even the right papyri? You have similarities between the facsimiles, but is there any connection between the papyri that came out here to Utah and the other papyri? And are there other things that demonstrate that this is actually the papyri?
Funny you should mention it. Yes. The most recognizable figure, of course, was the facsimile one. Okay. And it was found that other portions of the cut-apart papyri neatly fit against it that were all taped or rather glued upon one piece of paper and then scissored apart to make them easy to stack and put in boxes and so forth. So as the scroll went out a little bit, then there were some missing parts, okay, and then finally the last picture that would have been on it, which is depicted in facsimile 3 in the Book of Abraham, is missing. Okay, that's gone. That's one of the things that isn't there. Okay, but the church historian's fragment also fits the text of this scroll. Okay, it contains parts from the Sheat and Sansan that fit right in the scroll there by the same hand written in the first century that are part of that book. So the church historian's fragment is part of the scrolls that were there that contained the facsimile one, which the text of the Book of Abraham identifies as being a depiction at the beginning of this scroll, okay, which it was. There is no doubt that everyone in Joseph Smith's day, everyone contemporary with him, looked at that scroll with the facsimile one on it and believed that Joseph Smith was telling them that this is Abraham's diary. Okay. There are still Latter-day Saints today who open up their pearl of great price at the back of the Book of Mormon, okay, their triple combination. And they read right there where it says, the writings of Abraham of Egypt taken from the catacombs of Egypt, written by his own hand upon papyrus, okay, on and on and on. That's still printed in there. And this is still the introduction of what a Latter-day Saint initially believes about the Book of Abraham. later on, if something challenges his perception like that, something we'll call information, then he goes and modifies his perception by finding an apologist who has explored that and given him a good answer for it. If something challenges that perception, he finds another apologist who will eventually lead him to the secure idea that everything is fine, don't question, it's still what it's supposed to be. So there's a huge range of belief in what the Book of Abraham really is among Mormons even today.
The piece of papyri that never left the hands of the Utah Church, it is the same papyri, same writing that's unique to that time period, same text, same funerary text.
It is, and I erred a moment ago when I said that it was part of the Shiat and Sensen. It's actually a part of the writing of the Joseph Scroll, okay, which is, well, what we call the Joseph Scroll, because it contained the rubric writing. Okay. I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
This is the fun of live TV.
Well, it's the fun of live TV, yes, exactly. Okay, I remember when I went to the church historian's office to see, when I was assembling the photo montage of all of these different things, I was very fortunate and blessed to be able to acquire beautiful color photographs, the ones that were actually taken for the ensign. Okay, from the original negatives for those photographs that were published, or not ensign, Improvement Era. That's right. Okay, way back in 1968. So they were on 4x5 negatives, and the librarian at the Special Collections at Brigham Young University brought out an old shoot box and showed them to me, and I asked if I could have some prints made, and he said certainly. So I paid for beautiful 8x10 glossies of these, and then we worked with them for several months, getting them all to the same scale and size, and then joining the portions where they were cut apart in order to make these beautiful assembled murals, a fold-out in my book, if you will, that shows how they fit together. And so it's the first time anyone had ever done this, because even the Mormons would not try to. So yeah, there's a picture from my book, right there. Mm-hmm. Okay, it shows the facsimile one fragment, and then it shows what's called the Sensen fragment, which is called that because of the repetition of 4 Egyptian letters in there, which basically translate as breath or breathing. Okay, this was called a Book of Breathings. It was essentially instructions to the mummy to teach it how to breathe in the afterlife. Okay, that's what it was. Well, at any rate, though, we were talking about the Joseph Scroll. Yeah. Oliver Cowdery described a scroll that just blew him away. It had a picture of a serpent with legs on it, and he was thinking about the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That had to crawl on its belly, and it must have had legs before then. So here was a picture of that had to have a biblical connotation. He knew nothing about ancient Egyptian gods or anything like that, and so he described how beautifully it was written, with mostly black and a small part red ink. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we have in the church historian's fragment. I was telling the story when I went to the church historian's office. Yeah. I wanted a picture of this in color, because the only picture that we had of it was in black and white. And so I went in, and I went to the historian's office, a very young man, very naive young man, and I asked if I could examine it. I was told no. I was asked, could I get a color picture of it? Well, I don't believe we have one. Could you take one? No. I said, well, here's a black and white Xerox of it. Could you point out for me if there are any rubrics on it, any red writing? And they said they could do that, and they took it. And a week later I called for it, and I got it back, and it had, a couple of the characters that were indicated in red that were on it. So I thought, wonderful, thank you. And I left, and I took the paper with me along with a couple of other papers that had been associated with it. And when I got home, I was going through them, and I found a sticky note that had been attached to the back of it. And it was written in this interesting style. It said, yes, he came right in and asked for this, and brother so-and-so was really hot. What do we do, It was amusing to me. But anyway, I did verify the church historian's fragment then was a part of this scroll of Joseph, as we call it.
I want to flesh this out some more, but I want to go ahead and open up the phone lines. If you'd like to join in the conversation, our phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. We're talking with Mr. Charles Larson, the author of By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus, about the Joseph Smith Papyri and the Book of Abraham. Mr. Larson, not only do we have the similarities with the serpent on legs and the parallels with the close resemblance of facsimile 1, but Joseph Smith, you alluded to earlier, he actually produced an Egyptian grammar, didn't he?
Well, he produced what's been termed and called the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language, because that's the title that was written on it. Okay, no one, I don't think, ever expected that it was completed, but he used it to school his own scribes and certain intimates of his own followers, to persuade them that he understood what he was talking about when he said he could translate Egyptian.
And that grammar never left the hands of the Utah branch.
Never left the hands of the Utah branch of the church. It was among the documents that belonged to his secretaries, which allied themselves with Brigham Young and brought those materials out.
And when you compare those characters that he translates to the scroll, they're in the exact same order as on the scrolls that were turned over.
Yes, one of the arguments that some of these apologists, LDS apologists, have come out with since the discovery of the papyri, they're saying that, well, these couldn't be the same papyri that Joseph Smith translated, because obviously the translation isn't the Book of Abraham. Well, it didn't take a great leap of logic to reach that conclusion, but they're saying that it has to be something else. Fortunately, we have a contemporary document kept by Joseph Smith's own scribes, taught by Joseph Smith's own mouth, where Joseph Smith said, this little symbol here means such and such. And all the scribes copied that little symbol and then wrote such and such next to it in their books. Then he'd say, then this next little symbol here, and they draw that one, means such and such and so and so. And they'd write such and such and so and so. And they'd go down the page this way. And since Joseph knew that, well, he guessed that from the paragraph style that the Egyptian read from right to left, just like Hebrew did. Okay, and he was studying Hebrew under an ancestor of Eunybius at the time. So he went in order, in sequence, from this little sin fragment that adjoins onto the facsimile 1 fragment, and that's what everybody copied into their Egyptian alphabet and grammar notebook.
And we actually have a graphic that shows the differences between, or rather the parallel, where we have the papyri on one side and we have the manuscript in the other, and it's letter for letter in the same order, right to left, as he knew that Hebrew would read.
Right.
And it's striking that, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes just one character was translated into a whole paragraph.
Oh, yes, yes.
Which doesn't fit with
well,
our
because
actual
of the
knowledge
different degrees and orders and so forth. At this time, Joseph Smith was not just a frontier shenanigan puller. He was very well entrenched, and he could actually take the time to try to understand a little bit about how ancient languages worked. As I say, he was studying Hebrew under one of Eunybius' ancestors. Okay, he probably also was acquainted with the fact that the way that Greek was written. Okay, with the different. I mean, let's see. I think that Greek uses cases and so forth, and many other different types of ways that would impress Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was an intelligent man. He could pick up on all of this, mix it all up together, and do a Willy Wonka on it, and just make it come out sounding wonderful.
Well, let's go to some of our phone calls.
Oh, sure.
First, we have Galen from Salt Lake. Good to have you with us, Galen. Galen?
I'd like to ask Mr. Larson a question. Would he compare what he's found in the Book of Abraham papyri with the Kinderhook controversy and draw conclusions from that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Kinderhook controversy. Joseph Smith, well, first of all, what was the Kinderhook controversy? There were some men in Kirtland area that produced a set of bell-shaped copper plates that had some fantastic symbols inscribed upon them. They were held together by a rusting iron ring that was about to disintegrate, and they were all corroded and covered with wax and grime, and they claimed to have found it, and they took it to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith proclaimed that these were the writings of I can't remember even the name of the thing, some white Nephite that was one of the survivors of the last battles and so forth, and gave an account of his wanderings and travels and so forth. But he declined to actually translate them, but he made up a story that fit the context of the Book of Mormon for it. Well, the Kinderhook plates were shortly afterward debunked by the people who had actually made it. They said they'd actually put it together in order to go ahead and fool Joseph Smith. Members of the church didn't believe that. They believed these things must have been genuine, and people made up the story about the Kinderhook plates being fake in order to make him look bad. Of course, now there is one Kinderhook plate still remaining, and I believe it's at Oberlin. Anyway, a scientific analysis of it does show that it's made of an alloy that was produced in the early 19th century, common to plating material, that it was rolled, not beaten with a hammer. It has all of the characteristics of having been produced in a blacksmith shop in the 1830s. So the Kinderhook plates were fake. Joseph Smith did proclaim them to be genuine. And that is the context, really, with the Book of Abraham. They happened to be one thing, and Joseph Smith proclaimed them to be another that suited his need.
The one thing that's easier with the papyri is that we're dependent less on third-party accounts, because it's clear these are the papyri from the piece that the LDS Church had in its archives, clear from the facsimile, clear from the grammar. It has the same characters, the same pictures. It's clearly the same one. Whereas with the Kinderhook, there's a little more testimony that the LDS apologists love to jump all over.
Well, I don't know any LDS apologist now who would even try to say that the Kinderhook plates were genuine. Back then, though, in Joseph Smith's lifetime, they were almost forced to. They almost had to, because there was just no way that he could make such a blunder like that.
But don't they question whether he, don't they throw doubt onto some of the assertions that are made about his saying that they were?
Well, I think that they do, but then again, a believing LDS could just as easily say, well, Joseph Smith probably immediately saw that they were fake, and he was having a little fun with those guys. So it depends upon what you want to believe in the case of the Kinderhook plates. With the Book of Abraham, I think you can't just say it's what you want to believe. It's what does this evidence show you?
Because this is Scripture.
This is supposed to be Scripture.
This is just as much
Scripture as the Book of Mormon. This is not fooling around. This is not funning somebody. There are doctrines based on that. There are temple ordinances based upon this content.
The keeping blacks from the priesthood was based on this.
Yeah, well, a large part of it was, yes. A large part of it was.
Plurality of gods and a whole host of other things.
Many things.
Let's go to our next call. We have Jim from American Fork. Good to have you with us, Jim.
Hi, good evening. I wanted to say to Mr. Larson, thank you very much for your book. I read it 3 times, and your book and Van Wagoner's book on Mormon polygamy was enough for my wife and I to both leave the Mormon Church.
Beautiful.
It took us 2 months to read all these books, and that was it. If Mormons had said that a wagon load of mummies came to town, and that's how you got the Book of Abraham, that would have been enough right there to have never joined the church. Thank you so much.
Jim, thank you so much for your call. We have with us next another Utah County, Boyd from Eagle Mountain. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. I was calling in because I knew Dr. Lambert's wife, who had researched all of the records of the Mormon Church his whole life. And he was an expert in his field. He was a professor, started 2 universities for California, worked at BYU, but he researched, and he had a book on Abraham. I wondered if you've looked into his works.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, no, I'm not familiar with him.
Okay. If you would like to join in the conversation, the phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. We have Mr. Charles Larson, the author of By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus, talking about the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith Papyri. So the LDS Church finds out that there's no real ambiguity. Their own scholars and outside scholars all agree that this is part of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, specifically the Book of Breathings.
Yes.
And that Abraham is not mentioned anywhere within his pages, or Joseph, or any of the things this is what the Egyptologists back in the early 1900s had said it was.
Well, essentially, yes. It shows that all of the criticisms that had been raised, not just from 1912, but even back as early as 1860, when de Verrier came out with his work, looking at based just upon the facsimiles in the published Pearl of Great Price, all of the criticisms stood and all of the defenses fail.
So now you actually were a member of the LDS Church.
I was.
And was it this kind of information that led you to leave the LDS Church?
Similar, but it wasn't the Book of Abraham issue. It was primarily the Book of Mormon. When I was a young convert, joined when I was in the Army back during the Vietnam War, Mormonism was introduced to me, and I read the Book of Mormon and became fascinated by it, and gee, it felt good, so I guess I'll go and commit myself to this. So I did, and I got baptized, and then I started learning a lot of other things, and well, I'd already accepted some of it, so I might as well accept all of it, so I did, and I tried to be as believing a Mormon as I possibly could, and I think I was very zealous. Without being too full of myself, I really believed it. The problem was that I love history, and I love all phases of history, not just American history and church history, military history, but ancient history, anthropology. I majored in history, minored in anthropology with the emphasis on archaeology. I was going to BYU at the time, and I remember one day in particular that I'd be sitting in a class and we'd be studying Mesoamerican culture and architecture and so forth from, say, the Mayan period. And then I would go across campus into the Joseph Smith building, and I'd see pictures of the very same buildings that had been profoundly identified as belonging to a specific non-Book of Mormon culture, photographs of them all along the top of the wall with no explanation at all other than to give the impression that this somehow supported the Book of Mormon, because that's what the whole building was dedicated to.
And they used to show these pictures in the Book of Mormon of specific sites.
I think some versions of them still do. But this gave an impression that was totally false and totally misleading. It began to bother me. What I would do as a young convert, and I've told this story a few times, I would picture Mormonism as this beautiful pillar of truth just rising up out of a sea of confusion. But every now and then I'd find some little brick that was disjointed and way off over yonder and somewhere. So I'd have to go ahead and find an apologist who would study that, whether Sidney Sperry or whoever, Hugh Nibley, and build a bridge of rationalization to go and connect that brick back to my beautiful pillar so that it was all nice and clean again. And I did this for years and years and years until eventually, it was a day like that at BYU, I stepped back and I looked at that pillar, and it wasn't this perfect shaft. It was this Rube Goldberg structure that was all convoluted and didn't make any sense. And at that point, I didn't have a test of faith or a challenge of faith, because I knew that my faith in God was what I was relying on. I'd brought my Christianity right into Mormonism with me and was told that this was the basis upon which my Mormonism would grow. But I kept my faith in God, and I gave myself the right to ask questions. And as an LDS investigator under the missionaries, I had never done that. I'd simply accepted what they had told me and been told that I was investigating. Once I gave myself the right to ask questions, that began leading me to answers. What I had believed was that it was impossible to go and show that the Mormon Church was wrong. It wasn't impossible at all. That the critics were evil people that were only out for money, that were corrupting things, and all they did was lie. Well, you could find examples of people that do that, but generally, the critics were some of the most honest and sincere and careful people that I'd ever come across.
Now, People are going to be tempted to assume that you wrote this book just for financial gain. What kind of financial gain have you gotten out of this book by his own hand?
Oh, well, you mean besides the jet and the mansion and
Well, you actually haven't made any money on this, have you?
I've never made any money on this. One of the arrangements that I had with the publisher, and I haven't advertised this, I think I've only mentioned this once to a group of people, but one of the arrangements that I made with the publisher was that I was not to receive any royalties on behalf of this book, that anything to which I was entitled would go back to the publisher and be used to help subsidize the missionary work of other groups in making this book available at no cost to any Latter-day Saint who identifies himself and asks for it.
And if a current member of the LDS Church wishes to read this book, it's available free.
It is available free to them through the Institute for Religious Research. That's right. I and other people have funded this. I have never received or accepted a nickel for writing this book.
If people will go to IRR.org for the Institute of Religious Research, go to the Mormons in Transition portion, they can request a copy online of that, or the DVD that was made following their publishing of the book.
It's based on it, yes.
The Lost Book of Abraham. Either you can watch that video online, or you can request a DVD of it for free. They'll ship it to you for free.
Now, one of your callers mentioned that this book and another book brought him and his wife out. I've heard thousands of stories like that over the years since this book appeared in print, and all of them have been very touching. Okay.
There's so much more I want to try to flesh out, but I'm going to try to squeeze in a few calls real quick.
Sure.
We're going to have me back here. We have with us Hayden from Draper. Good to have you with us, Hayden.
Hi, I just had a question for Mr. Larson regarding this discussion, or people indicating that there is a language called Reformed Egyptian, and if anybody's committed to a translation on that's been published.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Good question. Reformed Egyptian is what Joseph Smith called the characters that the Book of Mormon were supposed to be written on. There was a small sample supposedly written, copied from these things that were taken around and shown to different people, and the church still has a small scrap of paper that is not the actual Anthon transcript, but was supposedly copied from the Anthon transcript. You might remember Mark Hoffman. Okay, the forger. He forged a beautiful copy of the Anthon transcript that was so perfect I wish it was real. But the funny thing is, it was a forgery. But when Hugh Nibley saw it, he looked at that and he said, well, of course that's translatable. Anybody can see that nobody could have made this up, thinking that he was talking about Joseph Smith making it up. However, Mark Hoffman had made it up. The term Reformed Egyptian, as I say, is one that Joseph Smith used. Some scholars try to use the term Reformed Egyptian to refer to Demotic or to even hieratic Egyptian, but that's incorrect. Hieratic is, again, just more or less a cursive form of Egyptian, of the hieroglyphic. Demotic is Greek influence upon that. There is no actual language called Reformed Egyptian, and certainly nothing in any of these papers that have come about from the supposed gold plates that resemble any kind of language.
We're going to squeeze in one more call. It's going to have to be really quick. We have with us Ron from Tooele. Ron, good to have you with us.
Pastor Wallace, Ron from Tooele, how are you?
Doing well. You need to make it short. We're almost out of time.
All right, I have a question for your guest. As a former Mormon, were you familiar at all, or are you familiar at all with Solomon Spaulding and the belief that Joseph Smith did not write the Book of Mormon, and that it was basically Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found, which was possibly stolen by Sidney Rigdon? Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, to quickly answer that, yes, I am familiar with that. I am more familiar with it now than I was just a year ago. I am amazed that there is so much persuasive investigative work that has been done on this. I think that while the jury may still be out, I think that a lot of the old questions that people assumed had been answered decades and decades ago are still very valid questions. I believe that definitely Joseph Smith had a good deal of material to work from, and I would not be at all surprised that a major portion of the historical writing came from the imagination of Solomon Spaulding, purloined by Sidney Rigdon, and passed through Joseph Smith as a way for Sidney Rigdon to introduce his Reformed Campbellism upon the world.
Real quick, because we're almost out of time, you saw these historical problems with the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. A lot of LDS assume that if they don't believe these, that they're going to have to throw out the Bible because they believe the Bible is just filled with errors and that it's not trustworthy. Have you found the Bible to be trustworthy very quickly?
I have. It's sad that so many people do that, because one of the things that they are forgetting, if they come to the conclusion that Joseph Smith was a liar, they need to remember that one of the things then that he would have lied about is the fact where he said that all of the churches are wrong. Okay, he had to discredit the Bible in order to create a void to fill with his restoration. Okay, I hope that people who feel a hunger for a spiritual relationship with God don't lose their Mormonism in order to lose their faith in God, because God's been there long before Mormonism. He'll be there long after.
Mr. Larson, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
If you would like more information, including the website for getting a free copy, if you're a member of the LDS Church, of Mr. Larson's book, or a free copy of the DVD, you can go to our website, ancientpaths.tv or christpres.net. We are a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We believe the Bible is not only the Word of God, it is our only infallible rule of faith and practice. We believe that we are sinners saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. And we look for not a perfect church, but a church that is constantly reformed and reforming according to His Word, holding up all traditions to the light of God's Word. We meet Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street, Magna. We have a sister congregation that meets at 3350 Harrison Boulevard in Ogden at 9 a.m. And we have a Bible study in American Fork where we're going through the Westminster Confession of Faith, looking at all the teachings of the Scriptures in a systematic way. We hope you'll join us soon. Until next week, we wish you the Lord's greatest blessings and hope to see you back this time next week. Good night. Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to worship with us. We meet Sunday mornings at 11 a.m., Sunday evenings at 5:30 p.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street in Magna. We are a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We believe that the Bible is our only infallible rule of faith and practice. We believe that we are sinners saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. And we try to stress biblical worship and simple biblical preaching as well. If you would like more information on us, you can go to our website at christpres.net or give us a phone call at 801-969-7948. We have a sister congregation, Berean Presbyterian Church, that meets at 3350 Harrison Boulevard, 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and we have a Bible study in Utah County as well. Well, a few weeks ago, we had with us Mr. Charles Larson, who discussed his book By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus. And there was so much feedback from that, so many questions, that we decided to have him back and to discuss it a little bit more. And so it's our great privilege to have him with us this evening. Mr. Larson, very good to have you back with us.
Thank you, Pastor Wallace. I'm delighted to be here again.
Now, your book, By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus, it's about the Book of Abraham. And unfortunately, we haven't posted your previous interview yet. We hope to do that within the next week at ancientpaths.tv. But for those who didn't see the previous episode, can you give us just a thumbnail sketch? What is the Book of Abraham?
The Book of Abraham is it's purported to be a translation of ancient documents that Joseph Smith produced during his lifetime. It's incomplete. He stops right in the middle because, of course, he got killed. But they established a foundation for many ideas and concepts that grew to become fundamental parts of Mormon doctrine, such as eternal progression, temple ordinances, and so forth. Many people believe that it was even leading toward a foundation justifying polygamy. It's an extremely critical part of Mormon scripture, even though it's so small, because it's the only piece that they have in their entire, the Book of Mormon, of course, the plates are gone. Doctrine and Covenants, you receive those by inspiration, and no one knows where the angel went. I don't mean to be irreverent to them, sorry. But the Book of Abraham was supposed to have been translated from actual physical pieces of papyrus that came into Joseph Smith's hands. And those pieces of papyrus still exist. And they have been rediscovered, and they can be compared to Joseph Smith's translation and his work. So that's why the Book of Abraham is so important to them.
Now, those papyri were rediscovered in 1966, Metropolitan Museum in New York. A professor from the University of Utah recognized the facsimile and how it fit with the Book of Abraham. It was negotiated, they were turned over in 67, and then it was revealed in the Improvement era in 1968.
Yes, with
front cover.
Much fanfare. The Deseret News had previously to that, I believe it was in December of 67, done a big announcement and announced the acquisition and rediscovery of these, and everyone was extremely excited at the time. And then, of course, when the Improvement era came out with that color photograph on the cover of Facsimile One, it was instantly recognizable to the drawing that everyone had. Well, that's the other thing unique about the Book of Abraham. It's the only scripture that has pictures. Okay, I mean, illustrations that are part of the scriptural body itself, and not just some other artist's impression of the scripture. So, but everyone saw that, they were just amazed and astounded. Oh gosh, the church is true. Look at this, here it is. So they waited, with bated breath for the experts to go and vindicate Joseph Smith the only way that could possibly be done, by taking what he said, what he worked with, and showing that it coincided beautifully.
And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this because it's in the previous interview, but how did they know, other than just the facsimiles fit, how did they know that this was in fact the Joseph Smith papyri?
The papyri that was used for the translation of the Book of Abraham was a scroll about 4.5 feet long called a Sheat and Sensen, which is a book of breathings. It opens with a picture of the facsimile one, and then it unrolls and it moves on a little bit further on until you get to the end where facsimile 3 would be. Facsimile 2, a round picture, is actually a hypocephalus, which was not part of the scroll. What they had sections of papyri that fit exactly with section 1. And so they figured, well, this is part of the book. Then someone compared a very little known and little discussed document from Mormon history called Joseph Smith's Alphabet and Grammar of the English Language, which...
You mean Egyptian?
Egyptian language. Did I say English?
Yeah.
Well, it was an alphabet and grammar of the Egyptian language. Okay, that's what he said it was. It had a lot more English in it than it did Egyptian, though, because he could take a tiny little symbol, and then he would go and give an explanation for that symbol. It's about, 2 or 3 sentences. And then if he put a dot next to the symbol, then he could give 2 or 3 paragraphs. And then if he put 2 strokes and a squiggle after the symbol, he could get a whole page out of that one little thing. And he went through talking about how this symbol is interpreted in this level, in this degree, and this, so on and so forth. So you could actually match up in the pages of the Egyptian alphabet and grammar that he kept, that his scribes kept, where he was teaching them how to read Egyptian, where they wrote in the margin the little symbol, and then they wrote the explanation next to it, which was a paragraph from the Book of Abraham. And when you took this scroll that attaches to facsimile 1, and you followed the symbols right to left, just as you would with Hebrew, and many other ancient languages, by the way, cuneiform, Sumerian, then those symbols lined up with the text that was given in this document. So there was no question that they had what Joseph Smith put forth to the Latter-day Saints as being the source of the Book of Abraham.
And one of the initial things was actually that it was backed on a map of Nauvoo.
Yes, not Nauvoo, but Kirtland.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kirtland.
Yes, and the papyrus fragments, A lot of people don't understand how papyrus is made. It's actually a plant, a fibrous plant that's flattened out, cut open, split. It's the leaves of a plant, and they're put together and beaten, and they form a kind of a gooey paste. Then they're crisscrossed like plywood on another matting of this kind of paper, and then they're rolled and pressed, and then they're left to dry in the sun. And it makes a very strong paper when it's new, but when it's been sitting around for about 1,000 years or 2,000 years or whatever, it becomes a little brittle. And to preserve this, they did the most sensible thing that they could think of, and that was to go and glue it to a piece of paper, rag paper. And get a large enough piece of rag paper. They use some drawings of a plat of the city of Kirtland. I think there were even some architectural renditions on the back of one of them for the Kirtland Temple. So yeah, that ties it again with the ownership of Joseph Smith.
So there was a great deal of excitement in 1968. This was on the front cover of Improvement Era, which has since become the New Era.
The Ensign.
Has it? I thought it was.
Yeah. Well, Improvement Era, then New Era, then Ensign. I don't know. Maybe it's something else. I don't read them. So.
But it was a church magazine.
Yes. It was the primary church magazine. Right.
Everyone was excited because this was going to prove that Joseph Smith was an inspired translator of ancient scripture, because no one in America could read hieroglyphics at that time, could they?
Well, no one could. No one could, and except Champollion's work had just begun to be discussed. There were probably a few people in the East who were perhaps as advanced as some people in Paris or London, but it was still a very growing science, and to most people it might as well be Martian. There was no way to tell what it was.
So now hieroglyphics could be read, and this could validate his translation.
Yes, by the time the papyri were rediscovered in the 1960s, Egyptology had been around for a long, long time. For over 100 years, its principles have been understood. Very little new has been discovered about it, regardless of what people would like to make you think. It was an understandable, although complex language.
Now, they delayed for about a year to give Hugh Nibley time to actually learn to read hieroglyphics.
Yes.
And that series never did give that series of articles never did give a translation of the papyri, did they?
No, it was basically, Hugh Nibley later on described it as skirmishing and sparring for time as he wrote these articles, which had to have some type of a faith-promoting bent to them, because the public at large, the church at large, wanted something coming from it. And so he put out faith-promoting articles about how, you see this up here, this is the 4 points of the compass, and then Hugh Nibley was, for those who knew him, he could talk about something for an hour without really saying anything other than good morning. Okay, and that's about what he did in these articles. He filled them.
Okay. So now that the papyri have been made public, and people have actually read them who can read hieroglyphics, are they what Joseph Smith purported them to be?
Not even close. Joseph Smith purported them to be the diary kept by Abraham while he was in Egypt, written by his own hand upon papyrus.
Hence the name of the book.
It's by his own hand upon papyrus. That's right in the heading of the book of Abraham. It talks about some papyri that have been found in the catacombs of Egypt, written by Abraham in his own hand upon papyrus. And that's what Joseph Smith reported them to be in his lifetime. That's what every Mormon clear on up to 1968 always claimed that they were.
What do they turn out to be?
They turned out to be common Egyptian funerary texts dating from the late Ptolemaic and early Roman period.
So around the time of Christ, or even...
About 100 years before, 150 years before.
And so a couple thousand years too late to have been Abraham.
A couple thousand years too late to be Abraham, and having absolutely nothing to do with Abraham or monotheism or Judeo-Christian thought or the Hebrews or anything. It is a totally pagan Egyptian funerary texts. Sheat and Sensen, it means book of breathings. That this little scroll was placed next to the mummy's breast in order to teach the mummy how to breathe in the afterlife as its first step toward the underworld.
Now, I just want to point people, I want to focus on the LDS response to this more this evening, but there have been criticisms going back 100 years prior to this,
Yes.
that the scene of Abraham being about to be sacrificed by this pagan priest, that this was not actually what was taking place, but it was a very common Egyptian.
That was recognized as early as the 1860s. Okay, when the book of Abraham was first published, it was not published as a scripture. It was published in the newspaper, the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo. Okay, in 1842 and 43, and they did the illustrations there, nice big woodcuts and so forth, and they'd give the text. But it was canonized after the Mormons got to Utah. I believe it was 1852 that it was canonized. And then it was published for the first time, I believe it was in England. Okay, and so the published as a book of scripture to go in the Pearl of Great Price as one of the sections of it. About that time, I believe a Frenchman by the name of Devarier came across these, recognized the theme, because again, Egyptian had been making huge advances. I mean, that was the high-tech scholarly field of the age, was to go and discover Egyptian. You had looters going in there, hauling back to, obelisks and sarcophagi and mummies and papyri all over the place. That's what people wanted to learn about. So the field had really grown by the 1860s, 15, 20 years after Joseph Smith's death. And he recognized these drawings that were part of the Book of Abraham, and he says, "Mon Dieu, that is not correct," or whatever he said. And he proceeded to go ahead and publish a little article stating that the Mormons didn't know what they were talking about because these were Egyptian funerary documents.
I think we have a couple of illustrations that shows facsimile one, the way that it was shown in the Times and Seasons, and then ultimately in the Book of Abraham, and then how that compares with the actual papyri, the disputed sections, that
Yes.
where it's a man's head rather than Anubis's head.
Yes.
That's
Yes, that's all. You'll find that in my book. In fact, I spent weeks doing the reconstruction and drawing of that restored drawing of facsimile one. I'm the one who made that drawing.
well, it's
based
not
upon the research of other Egyptologists.
obviously, instead of being a moment of triumph, this has become a huge embarrassment because it's not what it was purported to be. But there have been a lot of responses from the LDS, and that's what I want to focus on this evening. What have been the responses to your claims, and to the claim to those of others who have pointed out that these papyri that Joseph Smith claimed to translate, they're not from Abraham. They don't say what he said that they said. They are that he has apparently just made it all up, which brings into question his supposed translation of the Book of Mormon, which is also supposed to be from Egyptian. Mm-hmm. All his claims to being a prophet of God seem to rise or fall together with the Book of Abraham.
Well, you catch someone in a big, fundamental, critical lie, you're foolish if you don't ask what else he's been deceiving you about. Okay, so the Book of Abraham, yes, that was the one testable thing, and that was the thing which potentially could collapse Joseph Smith's credibility for all time as having anything to do with producing Scripture. Okay. I should mention here, Pastor, that when I wrote this book, okay, I worked on this I think I began it in the early 1980s, and pretty much had wrapped up the manuscript by 1985. It took about 4 or 5 years to write. And other people had touched these subjects before I had. You could go here for one part of it, there for another part. Someone would go and travel around and give talks and, make money or something and another thing. But the subject had been out there, it just hadn't been put together cohesively with the proper illustrations so that a person could understand it from A to Z. And that was what the task was that I set about doing when I wrote this book. So the criticisms had already been there in place once the book was released. And I covered, I explored the things that LDS intelligentsia and apologists would write about the other things that had come out about it and their reactions to it. And I developed a list of basically 8 approaches that they would do. 8 ways that the intelligentsia would respond to criticisms of the Book of Abraham in order to go ahead and turn it into something that could be palatably accepted as faith-promoting by a Latter-day Saint. Okay. I covered those in chapter 11 of my book. There are a number of different theories. Mistaken identity theory, mnemonic device, inspiration, a catalyst. I think of all of these, the one that most Latter-day Saints who become concerned about this, and I should say that that's really a small number of them, the one that most of them lean toward nowadays is the idea that these didn't have to be the Book of Abraham. It doesn't matter what Joseph Smith may have said or people thought Joseph Smith had said back in the 1830s and 40s. They're obviously not the Book of Abraham. They're something else. But Joseph Smith had to have been a true prophet, right? So how did he produce the Book of Abraham from something that isn't the Book of Abraham? By the gift and power of God through the Holy Spirit. He used those ancient artifacts as a catalyst for inspiration. And he may have even been mistaken and thought he was translating when he wrote down his inspiration. That's one theory, the mistaken identity theory. The other is that he knew that it wasn't, but he was afraid people wouldn't understand that, and so he said it was a translation. But he received all of this by inspiration, you see. Now, if you're willing to do mental gymnastics and accept that, then you can still hold on to Joseph Smith as being a prophet and everything else that goes with it, and the horse it rode in on.
I want to flesh this out, but I want to first open up the phone lines.
Okay.
If you'd like to join in the conversation, if you have any questions for Mr. Larson, we invite you to call in. The phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. We're discussing the LDS scriptures, particularly the Book of Abraham and Mr. Larson's book, By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus. Mr. Larson, let me backtrack a little bit. One of the things I know that I heard years ago was a focus on a man by the name of D.J. Nelson.
Yes.
Who was he, and what's the critiques surrounding
D.J.
him?
Nelson was one of the first people to publicly criticize the church's interpretation of the Book of Abraham and try to expose the papyri. Trouble is, D.J. Nelson had a credibility problem of his own. He was something of a showman and so forth, and he tended to exaggerate his role as far as the church authorities accepting him and so forth. He was a member of the church at the time, and from what I recall, and again, this is all so long ago and so irrelevant now, but D.J. Nelson was supposed to have been asked by Hugh Nibley to go and provide a preliminary translation of this because he put himself forth as an Egyptologist. Well, he was not an Egyptologist. It turns out that he purchased his PhD from a diploma mill, from a catalog diploma mill, and it had no credibility. He was a self-educated man with a great big silver Western belt buckle, and he loved to talk, and he was into a lot of other strange things like pyramid healing, and all of this kind of thing. So you take it all a little bit with a grain of salt, but he was very popular with his talks on the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith Papyri, as Hugh Nibley named them, because he could go ahead and say, this is what this is. And he was right, okay? But he was such a vulnerable target to be able to be attacked that it was almost inviting someone to do that. And that's just what happened. The case for the Book of Abraham and Joseph Smith became a case against this diploma mill graduate D.J. Nelson and what he was saying about it. In the early 1980s, there was a book that was written for the masses of the church, okay, people that were disturbed by this, and it was by a couple named Robert and Rosemary Brown from Mesa, Arizona. And actually, that's what my whole appendix dealt with, because at the time that was written, that was what was the most relevant thing. So I wanted to answer the criticisms that they raised, which, well...
They wrote a series, didn't they? What was it?
They
Lie
did
and Wait to Deceive?
They Lie and Wait to Deceive was the name of their book. And I believe that they wrote some other things too, but primarily the focus of their work was to discredit D.J. Nelson and thereby give credence to Joseph Smith. And what they were basically was regurgitators of anything Hugh Nibley said, and then they would go on and embellish this with some caustic cartoons and narratives of their own, and basically try to go and make a mockery of anyone who would dare to criticize Joseph Smith, because after all, he was a prophet, so he ought to know what he's talking about. Now, you got to understand that there are a couple of different camps here. There are the intelligentsia writing articles for things like Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, and later on Sunstone, and then even Hugh Nibley publishing this book and that book and the other thing, and later on different articles in the Improvement Era and in the Ensign and what have you. Those were things that the members of the church could know about, but very few would ever read. They might know somebody in their ward or even in their stake who had read that. And if the guy's still going to church, then obviously there was nothing wrong. That's all they need to go and bolster their testimony. But for their questions, pulp, like the things that Robert and Rosemary Brown put out, that was what they were devouring, and all they had to know was just what most LDS seminary kids know, that if you can mock your opponent, then you've won.
Richard Winwood used criticisms of D.J. Nelson as well. The funny thing is, despite his lack of academic credentials, his basic translation has stood up to examination. I mean, the folks who published your book have put out a video called The Lost Book of Abraham, and they have PhDs from Oxford, I believe, and a number of very reputable schools that they've all translated the papyri and come up with essentially the exact same translation, exact same conclusions as D.J. Nelson.
Yes.
So,
well, I wouldn't say exactly the same as D.J. Nelson, but his conclusions were that Joseph Smith was a fraud. Okay, but it gets a little more sophisticated than that. The authorities that were quoted in that film strip were primarily sought out and recruited in order to go ahead and restate the conclusions that I'd reached in my book and made, because I don't have a PhD in Egyptology. Okay, I mean, I have a bachelor's degree, for heaven's sake. It's in history and anthropology with the emphasis on archaeology. Okay, a person can learn Egyptian, but that doesn't make them a PhD, and it doesn't make them an Egyptologist. What I am is I'm a thinking person who looked at the material that was available, and I said to myself, there's a better way to organize this, there's a better way to state this, there's a better way to present this. That's what By His Own Hand upon Papyrus is a better way to go and state a body of information that was available, but perhaps not really understood, not clearly stated, not put forth in such a way that it could actually allow a person to reach a conclusion. So that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I addressed Robert and Rosemary Brown's critiques in my appendix, because at the time that was very relevant. Now, I'll share something with you, Pastor. After my book was released in 1992 and began to be circulated, it exploded like a bomb. Okay, the book is now sold, approaching 50,000 or over copies. Okay, But 30,000 of those copies were released within the first month that the book came out. And most of them were mailed directly to active Latter-day Saints that had been compiled from lists that friends and family members of theirs had provided to the publisher. And so the book was there, it was exposed, there was no way for the church to not deal with it. And it had been dealt with in talks at Sunstone and all over the place at the time. But it was like a bomb going off. And curiously, the work of Robert and Rosemary Brown with their pulp, mockery, and defense and so forth disappeared almost overnight. From that point on, it was not something that people were encouraged to talk about or examine. Far better to go and sweep it under the rug, discourage people from... I've heard from Mormons who said that they were told by their ecclesiastical leaders not to read this book. Right from the pulpit in the church, things have been mailed out, do not read this book. And then those people have read the book. I have seen entire families and extended families come out as a result of reading that book and realizing, now these are sincere Latter-day Saints, sincere people, realizing that they had been deceived and yet still loving God and wanting to know what God had for them. And I've seen people become missionaries, Christian missionaries as a result of it. I can't tell you. Well, I can tell you. You're a pastor. You've seen this. You've seen.
Oh
this.
yeah. I mean, I've seen fruit from us giving away this book. But we'll pick this up. But I want to go on to our first caller.
Okay.
We have Doug from Layton with us. Doug, good to have you with us this evening.
Okay.
Hi, Pastor. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Hey, I have two questions.
Sure.
One is how has anybody ever been able to produce any documentation that connects Joseph Smith with his translation of the Book of Abraham with the papyri? Number one, because I think at the beginning of the program you were talking about the Egyptian alphabet. From what I understand, though, that was something that was pinned on Joseph, but it was actually some of the more ambitious brethren trying to try their hand at explaining it. But that's question number one. Then
Let me answer question number one
two.
first.
Hold on. Let him go ahead and
okay.
then we'll just...
All right.
We'll take him... I mean, what's your second question,
Sorry.
Doug?
Question number two would be what does the thing actually say? What have we discovered about the papyrus itself, regardless of Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham? What has there been discovered, if anything, about the papyrus and the funerary text that is supposedly? Is there anything there significant? Is there anything, even though it may not be connected with the Book of Abraham, is there anything there of a intense religious interest? Especially, you and I have talked about the dispensationalism and the difficulty that brings up between the Christian church and the salvation of the Jews.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good questions. To answer the first one, the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, the popular take on it now by LDS apologists is that this was something that was just put up by the different brethren and so forth to try to see if they could figure out what was going on. That is not how it was understood in Joseph Smith's day. Joseph Smith recorded in his diary on numerous occasions and represented to other people that he was engaged in producing this alphabet and grammar of the Egyptian language. There are portions in his own hand upon paper, where he is drafting exactly the same type of things that these scribes supposedly working on their own are doing. That's the explanation that LDS apologists have had to come up with, because they can't explain away the fact that this is what Joseph Smith represented to others he was doing. We have no less witnesses than W.W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, numerous secretaries and scribes and so forth attesting to this fact as well. You go to primary sources and things that haven't been edited and doctored, and you see that Joseph Smith truly wanted people to believe that he really was translating this particular piece of papyrus into the Book of Abraham. Okay. The second question, can you recap that for me?
Yeah, he was wanting to know if there was anything of an intense religious nature in the papyri.
All Egyptian mythology is intensely religious. Okay, all of it is pagan. None of it is Christian or Judeo-related. Okay. I know that some historians and anthropologists try to go ahead and relate monotheism to the idea of one particular pharaoh that worshipped the sun. Then of course Joseph, when he went into Egypt, and Moses, when he brought the Israelites out, are supposed to have picked up all kinds of pagan Egyptian ideas. Well, yeah, they did, and that's why they built a gold idol and got smited when the law was delivered. They cleaned all of that up, though. Okay, the religion that Moses delivered when he delivered the law that became Judaism is what God intended it to be. That's the only avenue that's open for a believer. I'm a believer, that's what I believe, that's what the pastor believes, this is what any Christian with any ounce of sense believes, this is what every Jew in the world believes, okay? They know that the Egyptians were totally pagan. They know that Babylon was totally pagan. The world was full of pagans at the time, and only the Jews had the one true God. So you will find things that are what could be more intensely religious than folding up a book that is your passport to be able to breathe, for your dead, mummified, petrified body to be able to breathe in the afterlife? That's very religious. But that's the kind of religion that was in the papyri. Was there anything startling or new? No. There are thousands of these things, literally thousands of variations and spells is what these chapters are called, of the Book of the Dead. Nothing new, nothing earth-shaking, nothing worth more than a cursory glance by a couple of academics doing some graduate work. It's nothing earth-shaking at all.
One thing I'd like to add to what you said on the first part of that question, the Joseph Smith's Egyptian grammar, it's actually titled that, isn't it? And it never left the possession of the Utah Church. The papyri stayed with Emma, but the Egyptian grammar stayed with Brigham Young and everyone that came out here.
And the church naively, if they'd known what later apologists would have to contend with, they never would have probably done this. But in 1937, I believe it was, Sidney Sperry actually published photographs of the Egyptian alphabet and grammar to use as a missionary tool, as a faith-promoting experience for the saints, to show them this is what our prophet can do, and no one else has ever claimed to do something like that, so he must really be a prophet. He proudly called it Joseph Smith's Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Hugh Nibley was responsible for renaming it the Joseph Smith Egyptian Papers, which could mean almost anything. He was very good at relabeling things and doing this newspeak to things that had been not just traditionally but factually upheld as being one thing, and he turned them into another in order to facilitate his apologetics.
We're going to go to our next call. We have Galen with us this evening. Galen, good to have you with us. Galen?
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to ask Mr. Larson a question. I've heard that some Latter-day Saint apologists have tried to defend the Book of Abraham by saying that there was a separate scroll other than the one that you're talking about. Is there any truth that Joseph Smith had another scroll instead of the basic one you're talking about, and that he translated the Book of Abraham from it? I've heard that kind of argument. Would you comment on it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Joseph Smith had actually portions of 3 different scrolls. He had one that was identified by Oliver Cowdery at the time as being the scroll of Joseph, and he said it was a beautiful scroll that he described different drawings on it and said that it was written primarily with black but with a small part red ink and so forth. We have portions of that. That's a Book of the Dead for a woman named Tasherkin. I've assembled those papyri fragments from the collection that the church received in 1966. 67 in my book and assembled where they're cut apart, and you can actually see the portions of the Book of Joseph scroll. The Book of Abraham scroll was not described as having any red in it. Okay, one of the intellectual approaches or theories that I cover in chapter 11 of my book is the missing black and red scroll theory, and this was early on proposed by Nibley and endorsed by others and picked up on, that the Book of Abraham is so complex that it had to have had more to it than just this simple little thing here that we have, and the Egyptian alphabet and grammar is nonsense, so we can just discount it because it doesn't fit with what we want it to be. So there had to have been another scroll that we just don't have. Well, that's a nice theory, but it doesn't fit with the descriptions that were contemporary in Joseph Smith's time. Oliver Cowdery was very specific about describing a scroll with black and a small part red ink that he said was that Joseph Smith told him was the Book of Joseph. And there was another scroll that was very well described, very well identified, corroborated with the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, corroborated by the facsimile itself, which was put right in their scripture as being, I think a section of the text of the Book of Abraham even describes referring to the picture at the beginning of this book or the beginning of this scroll. Okay, and that's facsimile 1, right, exactly where it would be at the beginning of the thing. So no, there was no other scroll that was believed, purported, ever represented by Joseph Smith as being the Book of Abraham, Abraham's diary, other than the Shiatan Sensen, which turns out to be the Book of Breathings.
If you would like to join in the conversation, our phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. One of the things that is telling to me, but something that I think a lot of folks might tend to overlook, is that there was all this excitement when the LDS Church got these. There was a front page story, as we've said, on the Improvement Era, continuing series of articles for the whole year, basically. And yet, why is it that the purported successor of Joseph Smith, who also is supposed to be able to translate ancient documents as prophet of the church, why is it he needed Hugh Nibley to take a year to learn to read hieroglyphics?
Well, Pastor, don't you know that the Lord won't do for us what we can do for ourselves? Okay, yes, if Egyptian were still unreadable, then the president of the church, prophet, seer, and revelator would have translated it. But since Egyptian is now understandable, he's not going to go and have him do that. I mean, that would be a waste of gifts. So we need to keep that gift in the bank in case it ever is needed, in case they ever do get scrolls from Mars or something. And we'll just let our own scholars address it, because after all, these papers weren't received through some miraculous means, they were received by secular means. So have our secular scholars do it. And as long as they come up with something faith-promoting, everyone's happy.
You mentioned that some people have argued that it's a mnemonic device.
Okay, a mnemonic device, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
My pronunciation's off the sea.
That was one of the early theories, probably came right after the hidden meaning theory. Okay, I discussed these in detail. Let me start with the hidden meaning theory. And I'm just going to put my eyes on here and open this up because I don't want to get these out of order. Shall I go over a couple of these?
Sure.
All right. The hidden meaning theory. Okay, this was one of the first ones that came out, and the idea was not proposed by Nibley, but it was proposed actually 90 years earlier. Okay, by a man named Reynolds, when he was responding to some of the criticisms in the late 19th century about the Book of Abraham, and he said that the scholars, of course, this is before the scrolls were discovered, the papyri fragments. He was working just on the facsimiles, which were recognizable enough that you could actually read some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs on them. Okay, and so Reynolds was responding to this and saying, well, there's one meaning that the world has, but there was a hidden meaning that God preserved in here. And so the hidden meaning was what was discerned by Joseph Smith. And these pagan Egyptian priests may have copied, the same text over and over and over again, having no idea what they were doing, and built their own pagan beliefs and religions around it. But God had a hidden meaning in it that had to be discerned by the gift and power of God through Joseph Smith. That was the first one. Problems with that is that this text changed every single time it was written by the insertion of the name of the deceased that the spells were written for. And the spells themselves evolved as well over time. So the hidden meaning theory really didn't hold an awful lot of water. So then a couple of other scholars came up with a theory, John Tvednes and Stanley Crapo, called the mnemonic device theory. A mnemonic device is basically a prompting sheet. Okay, and anyone who's ever done any acting or studied scripts knows about prompting. They would look at the symbols in the Egyptian alphabet and grammar and all of the text that was derived from it. And then they would look at the Egyptian word, and they might have something like a definite article, the, this, whatever. And then they'd see the text of verses and so forth that go along and then are interpreted from this. And they might say, now, this priest was living in such and such a land, and then he did this and that and the other thing, and then, went to lunch at McDonald's. Well, because the word the or this is contained in both, then that becomes a prompt for the entire text in there just from that one word. And they really went to town stretching interpretations in order to try to go and make the verses fit, and they did it to the satisfaction of some people, and it's still even repeated today, that it could be a mnemonic device. No, because again, you have the same problem that you had with the hidden meaning theory. The text changes every single time a new name is put into it, the new person that the spell is written for.
Just for clarity's sake, this isn't a unique text.
No. It's not unique at all. This was done by the millions, okay? I mean, in the early 19th century, late 18th century, and even on up into today, Egypt was lousy with petrified mummies, okay? They were all over the place.
People were actually taking, mumia, which was basically ground up mummy?
Ground up mummy powder. It was supposed to go ahead and get you high or something, I don't know. The explorers would burn the broken mummies and so forth to ward off the desert chill while they were digging for loot. Okay, it burned really well. It had been soaked in pitch and so forth, and so yeah, this was not something that God would hide that way, and it really doesn't bear any relation to it. The mnemonic device theory was a desperate attempt to try to come up with an explanation for how actually, that was the last attempt to really try to join the Egyptian alphabet and grammar with the Sinsen papyri. Okay.
Now, one of the things that we get all the time, we have people telling us that obviously we have nothing of substance to share because we are responding to LDS claims. They ignore that the LDS Church claims to be the one true restored church, and all other churches are wrong. Presbyterians get singled out in the Pearl of Great Price of all places.
Joseph Smith did not like Presbyterians.
No, he did.
He had a bad case against Presbyterians.
We were top of his list.
Oh, yeah.
Joseph Smith's history, chapter 1, he tells his mother, "I've learned from myself that Presbyterianism isn't true."
Yeah. To their credit, though, the Methodists do take heat from him later. But yes, he started out down on the Presbyterians.
Yeah, but we made it into the scriptures.
You did.
So
yes, congratulations, Pastor.
Thank you. The idea many people have is that if we say anything in response to saying that everyone's wrong, that if we have any kind of response to anything, the Mormons, Joseph Smith gets to say anything he wants to. If we respond, then we're being hateful. We have nothing good to say. We have an axe to grind. I'm sure that you've been told numerous times you have an axe to grind. How would you respond to that?
Well, I haven't gotten rich doing this. I haven't acquired great
you haven't made tons of money off of this book?
Haven't made a cent from it. Every bit of royalty I'm entitled to is returned to the publisher in order to make the book available at no cost to Latter-day Saints.
If you could hold that thought, I just wanted to.
Okay.
People can actually get this book or the DVD if they're members of the LDS Church. They can get this for free
By
going
contacting
to
the publisher and asking them, that's right.
which is their website's irr.org.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to throw that in. But,
Well, thank you. They'll appreciate that. Okay.
but anyway, your axe to
Okay,
grind.
my axe to grind. Okay. I am a former Mormon. I live in Utah. I have lived in Utah since the year that I came here to go to school and help re-elect Richard Nixon. Okay. I've been here a long time. I have no intention of leaving. I own my home. I've raised my family here. I have my roots here. I feel like a stranger in a strange land, but I wouldn't stay here if I didn't love the people that I'm surrounded with. And whenever I express such a thought and I have someone say, well, then you must hunger for the truth and it's just waiting to reach you, I say, no, I have my God. I have my faith. I have a solid rock that I've built my faith upon, and that rock is Jesus Christ, revealed through the only scripture there is, and that is the Bible. But I love the people here. I have a burden for them. I feel for them. I can't not be here. But to say that there has to be something crooked, and there has to be something hateful, and there has to be some desirous motive in here to hurt, to destroy, I think that bears from the idea that so many Mormons have a problem with believing that you are losing light by leaving the LDS Church. Again, it comes from their impression or their belief or their deep-seated desire to want the church to be what it really claims to be. For anything to suggest that it is not has got to be from the adversary, and of course they're taught to resist the adversary, flee from the adversary, flee from their own mind if they have to in order to go and be obedient and in harmony. We could do a whole series of programs on the psychology involved in something like that, and I don't want to call it anything unkind other than a desire to have faith. But it's a faith that is based totally upon reaction and experience from within, and faith is not that. Faith is far more than belief. Faith is a verb. Faith is an action that is based upon belief and sustained by confidence in God's holy word. So that is all I would say about that.
I'm curious. In your appendix, you dealt with the Browns, but I also understand that that the publisher is coming out with a new edition of this book.
Well, yes. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the appendix in here, I've over the years, and particularly in recent years, people have said, well, why do you have all of that stuff in there about things that I've never heard of? I mean, these were people that were making fools of themselves a long time ago. And I said, well, that was written when they were doing that. But it is dated. Okay,
25 years ago is not as long for some of us as it is for...
You know it, Pastor. I feel your pain, okay? I admit freely to people that material is very dated, and frankly, I think it has no place really anymore in the book other than just a reference or a footnote as to how things were treated back in the old days. And the publisher does have plans to take this book right here and reissue it, updated, include the references and so forth from the authorities that are quoted in the film strip, and to make this book more modern, perhaps address some of the critiques that have been done by LDS scholars in the meantime. But again, I would simply add there that when I identified those 8 different approaches or theories, and we've discussed a couple of them tonight, 25 years ago, no LDS apologist since then has come up with anything new outside of them. Every single thing that, whether it's Richard Gee or
John Gee.
John Gee. Well, who on earth is Richard Gee? I have got Richard in my mind.
I think it's John.
Well, anyway, the Gee fellow, okay. Whoever it is, echoing Hugh Nibley's writings and recycling them, or some other new hero defender of the faith riding out on a white horse to go and save Joseph Smith, whatever. They haven't come up with anything outside of those 8 approaches that I was blessed to be able to go and understand 25 years ago. So you'll be able to read about some of those in the book. We could talk about more of them if you'd like, but let's see if there's anyone else that has a question.
Yeah, we have Mark from Salt Lake City with us. Mark, good to have you with us.
Yes, I was wondering, and I'll take it off the air, are either of you aware of any contemporary documents that would suggest anything to do with Mormon temple rights back in the apostolic age? Thank you.
Thank you.
Temple rites in the apostolic age. The only temple rites that were performed in the apostolic age were Jewish temple rites. They were very different from anything that the Mormon temple purports to have through its revised Masonic rituals and theatrics and 19th century melodramas. If you would like to know about the Hebrew temple, it's not sacred. It is considered sacred. In fact, I have a good friend who is a rabbi living in Jerusalem. He runs a small museum there. I've produced reproductions of ancient Jewish war coinage for him from the First Revolt and the Bar Kokhba Revolt that he uses in his museum to sell to raise money for what they call the Third Temple Project. He's an extremely Orthodox Jew. And there are groups of Jews that are actually involved in creating plans to build the Third Temple in Jerusalem. There was Solomon's Temple, there was Herod's Temple. The Third Temple is the one that will be built upon Mount Zion, and frankly, Christians also believe this because this is where Christ is to appear when he returns. So that was kind of exciting to know people that are involved in that belief. But my friend, okay, Svi, he shared with me architectural plans of the Third Temple that have been drafted, and an architect's model and photographs of it. Things like the silver trumpets, the candelabra, the showbread table. None of these things are in a Mormon temple. A Mormon temple, I think the only thing that you could even remotely say looks similar to it would be the bronze C upon the oxen's back that they've described in Solomon's Temple, which is similar to the way that the baptismal font that the Mormons have for baptizing the dead.
Well, we're running out of time. If you can give me about a 15-second answer to this one,
Okay.
just to flesh this out. So many LDS seem to have this idea that they're teetering on the edge, and if they lose their grip on Joseph Smith, there's nothing to believe in. The Bible won't stand up. Can you give a 15-second response, because we're almost out of time?
Okay. To any Latter-day Saint feeling that way, don't give up on God. Okay, God is real. God is what touches your heart. God is what speaks to your spirit. God is what gives you breath. God is what gives you faith and hope. And he does that in spite of any organization, especially an organization that's based upon trust in man and an arm of flesh. Do not give up on God. Return to a scripture that you know is a scripture, the Bible.
Okay. Mr. Larson, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great privilege.
Thank you, my friend.
And just to add to the previous caller's question and answer there, read the book of Hebrews. We have a temple as Christians in the church. We have a better priest, a better sacrifice, better everything. To go back to the old forms, mystical, read the book of Hebrews, basically.
Yeah, right.
But at any rate, next week we are privileged also to have another author. We have Will Bagley, who will be discussing his book, The Blood of the Prophets. If you have an opportunity, we invite you to worship with us Sunday mornings at 11 a.m., 5:30 p.m., 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street, Magna. And also in Ogden and down in Utah County, we have works there as well. We hope to see you next week when we'll be interviewing Will Bagley. Until then, we wish you the Lord's greatest blessings. Good night.